Hey everyone, as the Battle Pass is ending soon, I wanted to make this video explaining what each of the Battle Pass weapons do, who the Battle Pass weapons are good for, as well as some napkin calculations of the Battle Pass weapons versus the crafted weapons. Before we begin, I did want to cover over that the 1.1 Battle Pass weapons have been leaked and they are the exact same weapons as the 1.0 Battle Pass weapons. Now, it is not known if the Battle Pass missions will be the same, but you can assume that they're going to be roughly the same and work in the same regard of how to complete them. To unlock the Battle Pass as well as the Battle Pass missions, you do have to be Adventure Rank 20, and once you reach Adventure Rank 20, it automatically appears at the top right of your screen with this icon here. You can only receive the rewards seen at the bottom here if you paid for the $10 Gnostic Hymn paid Battle Pass. And once you reach Battle Pass level 30, you will be able to have access to this box here where you'll be able to select one of these 5 weapons. The first weapon is the Black Sword Longsword. It has a base attack of 42 at level 1 and a base crit rate of 6% at level 1. The passive is called Justice and increases damage dealt by normal and charge attacks by 20%. Additionally, it regenerates 60% of attack as HP when normal and charge attacks score a crit hit. This effect can only occur once every 5 seconds. This weapon is best used on units that auto-attack often or quickly, and because the second part of the passive heals you for a portion of your attack every time you crit, every 5 seconds, this allows you to run a non-healer build. This ability to be able to partially heal yourself can be very useful, especially in the Abyss, because in the Abyss you cannot use food or leave partway to go heal yourself. This usually forces you to have to bring a healer, but with this weapon you can often opt to not bring a healer and just bring a bunch of damage as long as you don't take too much damage. Now for who I'd recommend to pick up this weapon. Basically, if you own Kaching, pick this weapon up. This is her best in slot weapon, even compared to 5-star weapons. This is typically gonna be a better pick. The reason for this is because the Black Sword is currently the only longsword in the game that is 4-star or higher that has crit rate main stat. This is important because Kaching's crit damage increases as her ascension level goes higher. Without having a crit rate weapon, it is a little bit hard to balance out her crit damage, as characters will have a base 50% crit damage and 5% crit rate, and then if you add on top Kaching's additional crit damage, you're going to have 90% crit damage, in which you're going to want to have about 45% crit rate to balance that out. This is possible to achieve without a weapon, but the weapon just makes it a lot easier. Another character you could end up picking this weapon for is Bennett, because Bennett is a jack of all trades. He can heal, buff, DPS, and because he is a power unit, he can be useful on floor 9 and floor 12 as a main DPS. Now, you're not restricted to only these two people. You could always use this on Jean, Chi-Chi, or Xingqiu as main DPS or even as support, but I don't really recommend that you pick this weapon just for them because they do not have any modifiers in the Abyss, so it is a little bit harder to use them, and by modifiers I mean like increased elemental damage. Same goes for the main character. Now let's look at some quick napkin math. All these calculations were done by my friend Just Monica or Dan Scrub, so if you guys ever do see him around, please do give him a thanks for all the time and work he puts into these. These calculations were done a little bit short notice, so they may not be the most accurate thing ever, but him and me were in a call where he would put in the numbers and ask me questions of what I wanted, and we worked it out to get a acceptable answer. And because the Battle Pass weapons are the same for the next season, we will be working on these numbers more to get them more accurate, as well as comparing to a lot of different weapons and a lot of different refinements. So make sure you guys check out the Twitch and the YouTube to go see the rest of the calculations later down the road. And for the Black Sword calculations, we end up using Bennett as he was a lot more accessible than Kaching, and Kaching has a lot of formulas and testing done on her. For Bennett, we ended up using the rotation of Burst skill into Elemental skill into C4 or 4 auto attacks into Elemental skill. We repeated the auto attacks into Elemental skill chain 4 times over to end up with a DPS calculation of 20,142. And if you look here, versus the prototype Rancor, it's going to give you a 4.23% damage boost, but versus the Iron Sting, you're actually going to end up with an 18.15% damage boost. Now onto the next popular weapon of Serpent Spine Claymore. It has a base attack value of 42 and a base crit rate of 6% at level 1, and every 4 seconds a character is on the field, they will deal 6% more damage and take 3% more damage. This effect has a maximum of 5 stacks and will not reset if the character leaves the field, but will be reduced by 1 stack when the character takes damage. So this weapon is translated a bit funky. When it says every 4 seconds a character is on the field, it really means every 4 seconds that the character that equips this weapon is on the field. Another thing is that you can actually generate stacks out of combat for this weapon. Now a great thing about this weapon is that at max stacks, even at refinement 1, you're going to get 30% increased damage, but you'll also be taking 15% increased damage. This weapon is amazing for killing bosses, elite monsters, or trash monsters in the overworld, or even weekly bosses. However, when it comes down to the Abyss, it is a little bit of a different story, as you will be taking damage quite often in the Abyss, whether through field effects or through monsters. There is also no internal cooldown for you to be able to lose stacks, so you can end up losing all your stacks really fast. In addition, when you take damage, you'll be taking 15% more damage, 12% more damage, 9% more damage, 6% more damage, 3%, and so on. And you will probably end up dying from this very quickly. So that's why people consider the Serpent Spine a glass cannon weapon. If you want to bring this into Abyss and feel like you could end up dodging a lot of stuff, feel free to, but I highly recommend you try Abyss floors 9 through 12 before you end up trying to commit to this weapon, as you will have to be very focused and be very experienced to be able to use this weapon well. Now, who I'd recommend to pick up this weapon would basically be anybody who wants to use shielded units. Naturally, the only Claymore shielder is going to be Beidou, but in 1.1 we'll also have Xinyan. You can also end up using units that provide shields, such as Noelle, or Geo units that crystallize so that you can pick up crystallization shields. This will help prevent you from losing stacks as well as mitigate any sort of damage you do end up taking. But I do believe that the shield will end up taking 15% more damage if you do have full stacks. You can still end up picking up this weapon for your D-Luke or your Razor, but like I said, I really recommend you try out floor 9 through 12 to see if you can avoid the damage. Maybe even bring a Geo user or some shields to help block the hits. For this math calculation, we ended up using Razor, as Razor is a lot more accessible to people, and we already did this one for D-Luke. And for the calculation, we end up using our friend WinJay's Razor rotation. You can see it up here. I'm not going to go through it as it's kind of long. And for the DPS, we ended up with about 31,238 damage per second. Comparing this one to Aminus, it is a 27.49% damage increase, and versus White Blind, it is a 37.42% damage increase. We have calculated this also with 5-star weapons, and Serpent Spine is very close to the 5-star weapons, if not higher than some of them, such as Skyward Pride. This calculation was also only done with Refinement 1, with only 80% uptime, meaning only 4 stacks up at a time. So if you do end up having max stacks constantly, you will have even higher DPS output. But once again, don't be blinded by the big damage numbers. You will take more damage and you probably will end up dying very quickly. And dots or damage over time will also rob you of your stacks, so you could end up having no stacks permanently to lose all that big damage. Now for Solar Pearl, it has the same main stats of 42 base attack and 6% crit rate at level 1. For the passive, normal attack hits increase elemental skill and elemental burst damage by 20% for 6 seconds. Likewise, elemental skill or elemental burst hits increase normal attack damage by 20% for 6 seconds. Keep in mind the second half of the passive does only state normal attacks and not charged attacks. Most of the Catalyst users end up using charged attacks quite often, such as Klee for her bonus damage or Ningguang for her bonus damage. Mona even has a Constellation at Constellation 2 that gives a free charged attack as well. In addition, all Catalyst users currently have a very long elemental skill cooldown, with Ningguang and Mona having 12-second cooldown on their E, Klee having a 20-second cooldown on her E, Sucrose having 15 seconds, and Barbara having a 32-second cooldown. Now you can always use elemental burst skills to help increase the normal attack damage boost uptime. However, balancing out your elemental skill and elemental burst skill so that you have complete uptime can be a little bit wonky. Also, once again, you do not boost charge attack damage, which can suck. But on the bright side, it is a crit rate weapon, which can definitely help people like Ningguang and Klee. Now for those that I recommend to pick up Solar Pearl is basically those that really love Catalyst users such as Klee, Mona, Ningguang, etc. Especially if you do not have a 5-star Catalyst such as Lost Prayer. It is at the end of the day still a crit rate based weapon, and the increased damage that you can get on your elemental skills, your burst skills, and your normal attacks is good enough. Now for the math portion. For this calculation, we ended up using Klee, as there was a lot of people asking about Klee things. And for the damage rotation, we ended up using our friend Little Tortilla's rotation here. It's a 60-second long rotation that we ended up using to compare Widsith versus Eye of Perception. TLDR for that one, Eye of Perception is weaker than Widsith. Now back to Solar Pearl. With that rotation, we end up getting about 22,398 damage per second with Klee. That was a 22.51% damage increase over Mappa Mare. We did also nerf this number slightly, as we only ended up doing the average of the normal attack plus the E skill, left out the burst skill because it's hard to calculate the uptime without actually doing it ourselves of the increased damage boost. Now onto the bow of Viridescent Hunt. It has a base attack of 42 and crit rate of 6% at level 1. Upon hit, normal and aimed shot attacks have a 50% chance to generate a cyclone, which will continuously attract surrounding enemies, dealing 40% of attack as damage to these enemies every 0.5 seconds for 4 seconds. This effect can only occur once every 14 seconds. Now to showcase this bow's cyclone ability, we're going to show this video by Irukanji that has the size and the suction strength of the bow. You can see here that the size is fairly decent, but the suction is not that strong. It doesn't have a lot of pull factor to it. Now the Cyclone will end up doing 8 hits over the 4-second duration of the damage number here, and it is every 14 seconds, so you could actually end up using this on a support unit or a main DPS unit. The people I recommend pick up this bow are basically the people that are set on picking up Child, because Child has a crit rate mechanic where the more crit rate he has, the more damage he will do with his debuffs and Hydra explosions. If you do, however, end up having Skyward Harp or are going to pull for Skyward Harp, I don't recommend you pick up this weapon for him. Also keep in mind that the Rust Bow will also probably work with Child, and the numbers are very comparable to this weapon itself. As for the other bow users, I don't recommend you pick this up for them unless you are a huge bow fan, as there are always other alternatives and the other weapons have better value overall. And for the calculations, we end up using Fischl, but this was a C0 Fischl. C1 would give more damage, and for the rotation, we ended up using the Elemental skill into the Elemental Burst into C5 times 3 for 20 ticks of Oz damage. The DPS was 16,500 damage. And for this comparison, it is the one with the least confidence for ourselves, as we were in a rush and on short notice, so the attack speed was not considered for Compound Bow. So that's why this number is so high. It should not be anywhere near this high. And for Prototype Crescent, it is 3.62%, but Crescent relies on weak point and it will not really work in all situations. But keep in mind that Child's melee form is hydro damage, so the physical damage bonus from Compound Bow would not work for him. Now for the last weapon, Deathmatch Pole Arm. It has a lower base attack than the other weapons at 41 versus 42, but the crit rate is higher at 8% versus 6%. This here is the Deathmatch's base stats at level 80 at about 400 base attack and 33% crit rate. If you compare that to the other Battle Pass weapons, they'll have about 450 base attack and 25% crit rate. That's a difference of 50 base attack and 8% crit rate. Now looking at the weapon's passive, you can see here that it says if there are at least 2 enemies nearby, attack is increased by 16% and defense is increased by 16%. If there are less than 2 enemies nearby, attack is increased by 24%. Now the positive side of this weapon is that it does have higher crit rate. It does come at a cost of lower base attack, but that can always be remedied with having higher crit damage to make your damage output a lot better. The downside though is that this weapon, just like the Viridescent Hunt, does not have an increased damage multiplier on it, which ultimately does hurt the weapon, as this passive is pretty plain, like the White Blind or the Prototype Rancor or other such stacking craftable weapons. The only person I really recommend you pick this weapon up for is for Xiao if you do not think that you'll have a good arsenal of weapons by the time he comes out. When it comes to spears, there's not a whole lot of good choices out there, but to be fair, there's also not really a lot of spear users out there either. For this DPS calculation, we end up using Xiangling as she's quite accessible, and this is the rotation as you can see here. And the damage per second was 28,420. When you compare that to the Crescent Pike, it is the only BP weapon that has a damage loss versus the craftable weapons. But this is because the Crescent Pike was basically made for Xiangling, doing more damage the more hits you end up doing. When it comes down to Xiao, the Crescent Pike will probably not be a good option for him, as he does a ton of anemo damage and not physical damage and a lot of plunge attacks. And although I did state that the passive on the deathmatch is pretty lackluster, I did hear from Monica that the deathmatch is actually not that bad of a choice compared to the best in slots if you are on a budget. Now for the big question of what weapon I will end up picking. It is actually going to be the Black Sword. The reason for this is because it's basically Kaching's best in slot, even though I don't own Kaching, and it also allows longsword users to be able to run in the abyss without a healer some of the times. However, for the second battle pass, I may end up picking a Viridescent Hunt. I have to go and see what Child's internal cooldown will be like for his debuff and explosion proccing before I rely on the full crit build. but I will also probably end up pulling for the Skyward Harp. The other option was the deathmatch for Xiao, as I don't really have a lot of good spear options, as Dragonbane is not good on him with the elemental main stat. For Solar Pearl, I'm not a huge fan of Catalyst users, and for Serpent Spine, I am always playing this game while streaming, so I can never have enough focus to be able to avoid all the hits. That's going to be all for this video. Once again, huge shoutouts to my friend Just Monica or Dan Scrub for doing these calculations so short notice for me. Comment down below which Battle Pass weapon you ended up picking, and if you do end up regret picking that weapon, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing for more Genshin Impact content. Join our Discord, follow me on Twitch and my socials to get these tips at a faster rate, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!